Hi, everyone. This is a commentary on our discussion about music, and it's a reflection on our discussion about music. And let me remind you where we're headed in our class and what themes that we're dealing with. You know, recalling Plato and recalling the opposition between, on the one hand, the normal life of convention, error, prejudice, limitations, and the status quo. All those things are kind of lumped together in the condition of the people in the cave. What Plato shows is emerging out of the cave through education and personal growth. That's up the tunnel there and into basically a realm of truth and a realm of essences and a realm of certainty. Okay, so that opposition is part of what Plato is trying to show us. However, he's also showing us that it's not so simple, because the communication between the one or the ones who have made that journey and have transformed themselves to basically a higher vision and a higher understanding of life, find it all but impossible to communicate that to the mass of human beings. Okay, and what's more controversial really is Plato showing that the relationship between the prisoners who have escaped and the prisoners who are still there in the cave is not just one of lack of understanding and distance, but it's one of hatred and resentment and resistance to change. And that's the really unique and controversial part of what Plato is saying. Plato is underlining the resistance that people have to education and personal growth. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that Plato thinks that, and there's a big difference between those two things. And I'm saying that this is where the role of the student of the humanities is very interesting, because Plato is showing us this opposition, and he basically is telling us to decide for ourselves. He's setting up the opposition and the hostility and the antagonism, and he's basically saying, work with it. I am trying to frame this and to contextualize it by saying that there is a kind of parallelism, excuse me, or an analogy between this opposition and that of Socrates, Jesus, Dr. King, and many other figures like that. I'm choosing those because they're the best known. Sorry, I have a frog in my throat here. Now, we have gone on to say that the arts play a very specific role in that, because they are not rational discourse. They are not argumentative discourse. They come from a different place and they go to a different place. And I'm basically lumping together literature, music, painting, dance, and theater, and saying that they basically touch us in a different way. Okay, and by extension, I'm saying that because of this, the arts and the humanities are of great importance. And then continuing this argument, I'm saying that any culture, any country, any group of people who are hostile to the arts is putting themselves or itself into serious danger, because they are losing the sense of the future. Now, whether is that true or not, it's a vision that I'm presenting to you. Now, it gets more complicated, and this is where the reference to Mozart in the Jungle comes in, and you can see this live streamed on Amazon. And I think it's really worth, at the very least, watching a couple of episodes at the very beginning, and watching either season 4 or a couple of episodes from season 4. They're only 30 minutes long. Okay, let me cut to the chase here. Check my time. Doing fine with the time. What I almost said Plato. That's what Amazon is telling us is that it's really not so simple, because it's not as though music has a permanent, absolute, unproblematic essence or a status. What that whole 4-year now film is showing us is that the very meaning of music is being put into question. How do they do this in the film? This is it's very easy, even though, there's 45-ish episodes now. It's basically a very simple arc. I don't even want to call it a plot. It's an arc of ideas about the nature of music. And what they're showing us is the most traditional, the most historical, the most stable of all the musical forms is probably classical music. I mean, it goes back basically, very roughly, at least 400 years, 450 years. I mean, obviously there's changes in the history of music, but there's a canon of music that's pretty fixed. Whether if you go through Bach, Haydn, Vivaldi, Beethoven, and into the 19th, and through to the 20th century, there's a series of composers that form a kind of lineage or a tradition. Okay, now what Mozart in the Jungle is showing is at least 2 things. First of all, it's showing that not many people are really interested in that. And even though there is an audience for this kind of music in terms of global interest and global affection and widespread understanding, there's not, I don't want to say it's centered in New York, Chicago, and whatever. In San Francisco, that's most certainly not true. But still, in terms of absolute numbers, it's very small. 100% of the world's population has heard the Beatles. How many people have heard whatever? The Bach cantatas. Not really very many. Okay, so what the program is showing us is this is in crisis. That is to say, there's a real distance between the wider community and that form of music, number one. Number two, that the artists are equally, basically, in crisis. I mean, they're psychological wrecks. They don't get along. They're dissatisfied. They're under threat from issues of funding and that sort of thing. There's a lot of turmoil. So what's going on there is there's a crisis in music. The form is not widely known anymore. The artists suffer from that. There are numerous conflicts at those levels. Okay, so what does the contemporary trained musician have to do? They have to invent an art that makes contact with the wider public, and that's what all the main artists and conductors and composers in that TV series are trying to do. I won't enumerate them because it's pretty obvious, and it's the concept that's important for us. And so the idea here is that if the arts give us a contact with reality and with truth and with spirituality that is in some ways missing in other modes of discourse, they can also come under attack. They can also change. And so the question is, if a culture or a community loses one of these modes of discourse, what happens to their access to higher things? And this is where, once again, this is where the student has to come in and respond to that question. I mean, it's easy to say, well, who really cares about, about Beethoven? But that's not the question. The question is this whole form of art dissolving, basically, in this part of the 21st century, as represented by the by that program. And if it can happen to the most stable form of art, it can most certainly happen to any other. Okay, so that's why I think the program is really interesting, and it shows the younger artists trying to invent new ways of making contact with the people, and that's why I posted those clips from the program and from that New York Times article, because I think those are sounds that we're not used to hearing. And I wanted you to think about this, because, of course, if an artist is looking for new forms of discourse, if an artist is looking for new forms of expression, the sound is going to be peculiar to us. And we're not going to be comfortable with that, just as the prisoners are not comfortable with the escape prisoner coming in and trying to explain things to them. And so the question is, what is valuable discourse? What should the arts be doing? And this is, of course, the ideal way to begin to conclude a course like ours, to ask, what is the value of the humanities? What is the value of the arts? And what form do they take in a period that is basically, a period of technology and a period of mass consumption? Okay, and so what is a moment of insight? What is a moment of truth? And as you see, this is where it gets very complex. And of course, like ours, if it's not going to be trivial, is going to be kind of complex and leave you with more questions than answers. Now, there's a little in the last 2 minutes here. Let me sort of say something. This is where it's encouraging and interesting that a company that's there to make money, like Amazon, can put on something like this and find the actors and the directors, and as in the film directors, and the musicians to make this work. Is that TV program perfect? Most certainly not. Is it without errors? Most certainly not. It has all kinds of flaky things and things that don't work. But that's part of what's interesting for me. That is to say, you can see the rough edges on it. You can see the things that don't work. We don't really see why there's a sort of happy end at the end of year 4, season 4, when the young oboist kind of comes into her own and becomes creative. Well, we don't really see why that works. One moment she's choking and, with the mercy of her father and the conductors and that whole musical world, and suddenly she's a free, heroic success. I mean, that doesn't really make very much sense. On the other hand, we do see that as something potential. And so even if the expression of all these situations is flawed, being able to express them as possibilities, I think, is really very interesting. Okay, that was a kind of a long little talk, but I think it shows really how vital we are and how much we're trying to get it right. And even though that's complicated, it's still most certainly possible. Okay, thank you very much for your patience. I welcome any questions about this. I'm going to set up a question discussion board under my blog. Okay, thank you very much.